The towering glass walls of Ethan Collins's penthouse cast shadows against the city skyline, and every corner of his mansion reflected his wealth, success, and uncompromising taste. Ethan was the kind of man people spoke about in whispers. His face graced the cover of financial magazines, his net worth was envied, and his ability to strike fear into the hearts of competitors was legendary. In the world of high finance, Ethan was a mythic figure, a ruthless businessman, a decisive CEO, a man whose presence commanded every boardroom. Yet, within the luxurious emptiness of his home, Ethan was simply a man alone. He moved through his mansion with a measured calm, each step precise, each breath controlled. His life was a series of schedules, meetings, and decisions. For most, it would have been unbearable, but Ethan found comfort in control, in never deviating from his meticulous routines. This was his armor against the world, and he wore it well. Yet, his silence and restraint only reinforced his isolation. The only person who entered this guarded world was Sarah. For 15 years, she had been the quiet force that kept his life in order. She managed the home as if it were her own, a discreet presence who anticipated his needs without a word. Sarah had grown accustomed to Ethan's coldness, his rare words, and his perpetual distance. But behind his stoic facade, she sensed an unspeakable loneliness that occasionally flickered in his gaze. Over the years, she'd seen hints of it. A lingering look out the window, a hesitation as he entered his empty bedroom, moments of silence that felt more like pauses than peace. "Mr. Collins." She greeted him each morning in the same unassuming manner, her voice soft, unwavering, as she poured his coffee. He responded with a slight nod, sometimes muttering a brisk, "Thank you, Sarah," though never meeting her eyes. For Ethan, Sarah was an unspoken constant, someone who was simply there, reliable and quiet. But that morning, as Ethan looked across his nearly empty dining table and accepted his coffee, something different lingered in the air. The quietness felt heavier, more pronounced. Perhaps it was Sarah's thoughtful way of placing the cup before him, or the way she straightened the silverware so that everything was perfectly aligned. In a life where people came and went, she had been his only constant, the one figure who had not flinched at his commands or recoiled from his silence. In a rare, uncharacteristic moment, he looked at her, his gaze holding a question he didn't voice. Sarah noticed the unusual pause and held her breath. For an instant, it seemed as if he might say something more, a vulnerability almost breaking through the walls he had so carefully built. But as quickly as it came, the moment passed. "Anything else you need today, Mr. Collins?" she asked, maintaining her professional tone. Ethan cleared his throat, his expression guarded again. "No, that'll be all, Sarah." As she retreated to the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen a part of him that was rarely exposed, a part that was, perhaps, seeking connection yet terrified of it. And while she knew better than to dwell on it, a small voice inside her wondered just how deep that loneliness went. For now, though, she put those thoughts aside and returned to her work. Ethan Collins was her employer, a man who wore his solitude like armor. Yet, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt to look past that cold exterior, even if he would never allow anyone to get close enough to understand it. Let me know how this resonates with the story structure, and if you'd like to move on to part 2, or have any adjustments. The clock struck 8, and the Collins mansion was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun filtering through vast, floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah moved through the grand rooms, adjusting a vase here, smoothing a wrinkle in the drapes there. Though the house gleamed, the way she managed her tasks spoke to her care for the place, each touch discreet yet thorough. This attention to detail wasn't driven by duty alone. There was something about maintaining Ethan's environment that gave her a sense of purpose, a calm in the silence of her own life. 15 years. 15 long years she'd spent working under Ethan Collins, a man as powerful as he was distant. She had watched him build an empire, growing colder and more formidable with each passing year. She remembered a time when he was merely a young, ambitious entrepreneur with an intense focus and a sharp gaze. Back then, Ethan had not yet acquired the air of isolation that now hung around him like a shadow. Over time, however, he had transformed, hardening in ways that seemed to push people away. And yet, despite the intimidating aura Ethan carried, Sarah couldn't help but see something beyond his exterior, a glimpse of a man who, despite his wealth and influence, seemed profoundly alone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Sarah had caught fleeting moments that revealed his isolation. A hesitation before speaking, an empty glance through his office window, his reluctance to even return to a quiet, empty mansion at night. She had wondered, though only in the quiet of her own mind, how a man who possessed everything still seemed so profoundly incomplete. Sarah's heart felt a pang of sympathy, an emotion she quickly smothered. She was his employee, not his friend. She reminded herself of this every time she felt a flicker of compassion for him. Her role was simple: maintain the house, organize his affairs, and respect the boundaries he had set. She had built her life around these duties, and over the years, she'd convinced herself that she was content. But sometimes, alone in the vastness of the mansion, Sarah felt trapped in a role that required her to be invisible. Her life was structured around someone else's needs, with little room for herself. Outside of her role as Ethan's housekeeper, she had few friends, fewer dreams, and often wondered if, like Ethan, she had built walls around herself as well. Her attachment to the mansion, to Ethan's routines, to the silence of the household, it was a comfort that both soothed and confined her. Every now and then, when her mind wandered, she would wonder what Ethan would be like without the walls he had built around himself. She imagined him in another life, a man capable of laughter, of warmth, of companionship. But as soon as she caught herself thinking this, she would admonish herself for such foolish thoughts. Ethan was a man driven by his ambitions, and that ambition had cost him his humanity, bit by bit, until he was as hard and unyielding as steel. As she arranged flowers on the dining table, lost in her own thoughts, the sound of footsteps made her freeze. Ethan entered the room, his usual impassive expression giving nothing away. He walked over to his seat, barely glancing at her as he sat. Sarah noted his exhaustion, the subtle shadows under his eyes, the slight droop of his shoulders. It had been a long night for him. She could tell from the way he moved, every action carrying a slight heaviness. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she greeted softly, maintaining the formal distance he preferred. Ethan gave her a barely perceptible nod, his gaze shifting momentarily to the window. "Morning, Sarah," he replied in that clipped, quiet tone. He sat down, glancing at his meticulously arranged breakfast, and then back out at the city skyline. His fingers drummed the table lightly, a sign of restlessness she'd rarely seen in him. For a brief, silent moment, she considered saying something, anything, to ease the quiet tension in the room. But as always, she swallowed her words, choosing instead to quietly step back. As she made her way back to the kitchen, however, she felt an unexpected frustration simmering beneath her calm demeanor. After so many years, she knew him in ways no one else did. She knew his routines, his unspoken preferences, even his vulnerabilities. But she was also painfully aware that she would always be just Sarah, the housekeeper, a silent figure in the background of his life. She didn't know what she expected. Maybe it was foolish, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that they were both trapped in different prisons, both longing for connection, yet bound by their roles. Still, she reminded herself of the boundaries. Ethan Collins was her employer, a man as unreachable as he was magnetic. He wasn't the kind of man to let anyone get close, and certainly not someone like her. Whatever sympathy or curiosity she felt for him had to be buried. As Sarah began to wash the dishes, the weight of her own isolation settled on her shoulders. Despite living in a mansion filled with the finest things, she too felt empty, like a fixture in a life that wasn't her own. She was invisible to the world outside these walls, and even more invisible to the man she worked for. But if there was one thing she'd learned over the years, it was that some people built walls for a reason, and perhaps her purpose was to respect them. And yet, as she cleaned the last of the dishes, a small voice in her mind dared to question whether there was a way for either of them to break free of these carefully constructed barriers. That thought lingered, filling the silent mansion with a tension that was all too familiar. Sarah had just finished dusting the grand library, a room rarely touched since Ethan's busy life left little time for leisurely reading, when she heard her name. Startled, she turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, hands casually tucked into his pockets. His presence there, of all places, was unexpected. Ethan almost never sought her out. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like a word." She nodded, her hands clasped nervously in front of her, waiting for him to speak. Usually, Ethan's interactions with her were confined to brisk greetings or requests, his voice detached and direct. Yet here he was, pausing as if unsure how to begin, his gaze drifting over the room before it settled on her. "There's an event tonight," he began slowly, almost as if weighing each word. "A dinner with a few investors. Important names, high expectations." He took a short breath and continued, "My usual companion is unavailable. I need someone to fill in, someone I can trust to be discreet." The words hung in the air, and Sarah blinked, absorbing their meaning. She couldn't remember the last time he had asked her for anything beyond her regular duties, and the idea that he might consider taking her, his housekeeper, to an event filled with the elite and powerful struck her as utterly surreal. Surely he had other options, women from his circle who would leap at the opportunity to be seen on his arm. "Me," she said, unable to mask her astonishment. She instantly regretted it, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "Yes, you," Ethan replied, his tone even but with a slight edge, as if he were almost expecting her to argue. "You've worked for me for 15 years, Sarah. You know what I expect, how I conduct myself. You know how to remain unobtrusive. That's exactly what I need tonight." She hesitated, her mind racing with questions. Attending a high society dinner, sitting among Ethan's peers, was far outside her realm of experience. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, let alone rubbing shoulders with financiers and business moguls. The very thought made her pulse quicken. "Mr. Collins," she began carefully, her voice soft. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I don't exactly fit into that world." Ethan raised a brow, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "I don't need you to fit in, Sarah. I need you to be reliable, calm, and yourself." He paused, his eyes softening ever so slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "You are more than capable, or I wouldn't have asked." There was an honesty in his tone that caught her off guard. For all his detachment, she had never doubted Ethan's sincerity when he spoke, and his confidence in her was unexpected, almost flattering. Still, the thought of entering a world that was so alien to her was daunting, and Ethan, reading her hesitation, took a step closer. "If it makes you uncomfortable, I won't insist," he said, his voice lowering. "But I could use the support of someone I trust. It's a business dinner, not a social event, so there won't be unnecessary attention." Sarah could feel her own resolve wavering, his words somehow steadying her. She knew she was simply a placeholder, someone convenient to help him maintain his polished image. But his appeal to her sense of loyalty was difficult to ignore. In a way, she had always been someone he could rely on, quietly managing his affairs from behind the scenes. Perhaps tonight would be just an extension of that, albeit in a far more public setting. After a moment, she gave a small nod. "All right, Mr. Collins. If you think I'm suitable for it, I'll accompany you." A faint glimmer of approval crossed Ethan's face, and he gave her a single nod, his expression returning to its usual composure. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll have the car pick us up at 7. There will be a dress waiting in your room, something appropriate for the evening." She felt her heart skip a beat. A dress, appropriate for the evening? The thought both thrilled and unsettled her. Her wardrobe was simple, filled with modest, practical clothing. The idea of wearing something elegant, possibly extravagant, felt like stepping into someone else's life, someone who belonged in Ethan's world. As he left, Sarah stood rooted in the library, grappling with an overwhelming blend of emotions. She returned to her duties, but her mind lingered on the conversation, her heart a mix of nervous excitement and dread. There was no doubt that this would be more than just another routine task, yet she tried to assure herself that it was merely an extension of her role. A task, she told herself, nothing more. That evening, as she entered her room, she saw it, a dress draped over the bed, shimmering in the dim light. Its soft, deep shade of emerald green was unlike anything she had ever worn, its elegant cut both refined and daring. She touched the fabric carefully, almost reverently, the silk smooth beneath her fingers. A quiet thrill ran through her, a nervous excitement blooming in her chest. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, the weight of the evening began to settle upon her. She would be stepping into a world where every glance would judge her, where people like her rarely ventured. For a fleeting moment, she wondered what people would think when they saw her by his side. Would they assume she was an outsider, a simple employee playing dress-up, or perhaps that she was someone more? With a sigh, she shook the thoughts from her mind. She reminded herself of Ethan's confidence in her, his rare but unmistakable assurance that she could handle this evening. There was no room for doubt, she told herself, and if Ethan believed in her capability, she would face the night with the same poise she applied to every task in his home. As the clock neared 7, she took one last look in the mirror. Her reflection was strange yet captivating, as if she were seeing a different version of herself. She smoothed the dress, took a steadying breath, and left her room, her footsteps soft but resolute. In the foyer, Ethan waited, looking every bit the polished, powerful businessman she had always known. Yet as she approached, his gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite place. A brief but noticeable pause, as though he were seeing her, too, for the first time. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low murmur, though his eyes held an unusual warmth, barely hidden beneath his usual reserved composure. "Yes, Mr. Collins," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded, offering his arm with a gentlemanly grace that both surprised and disarmed her. With a final, steadying breath, Sarah took it, and they walked out together into a night that would challenge every boundary she'd spent years constructing. Sarah sat in front of her small mirror, staring at her reflection, feeling both strange and vulnerable. Her hands rested uneasily on her lap, her fingers running along the soft fabric of the emerald dress that Ethan had left for her. It was elegant, refined, and undeniably beautiful, but it was a piece of another world. A world she'd only glimpsed through news articles and photos, a world where women wore expensive gowns without a second thought. With a nervous sigh, she reached for the jewelry box that had also been delivered to her room, a pair of delicate, understated earrings and a thin bracelet that sparkled faintly in the light. Sarah placed the earrings on her lobes, fastening them carefully, and secured the bracelet around her wrist, feeling the weight of the jewelry like a reminder of the unfamiliar path she was about to walk. As she put on the final touches, brushing her hair into a soft, elegant style that framed her face, Sarah felt the same question circling her mind. Why me? She was certain that in Ethan's world, there were women who would gladly accompany him, who would not only fit the image of a glamorous companion, but also know exactly how to behave among people of his stature. She couldn't fathom why he would bring her, a housekeeper, a quiet presence he rarely spoke to outside of giving instructions or receiving his morning coffee. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She turned to see Lydia, one of the newer house staff, standing there with wide eyes, taking in Sarah's appearance with a look of admiration. "Oh, Miss Sarah," Lydia breathed, her face breaking into a smile. "You look like someone straight out of a magazine." A faint blush rose to Sarah's cheeks. "It's just this dress," she replied, downplaying the compliment. "It's a loan, really. Just for tonight." Lydia tilted her head, looking at her thoughtfully. "But you look lovely. It suits you," she said, her voice sincere. "Are you nervous?" Sarah forced a small smile. "A little," she admitted, though her heart was pounding. "This world isn't mine, Lydia. but I'll do my best." Lydia took a step closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Mr. Collins wouldn't have asked if he didn't think you could handle it," she said with a knowing look. "Maybe he sees something in you that you don't see yourself." Sarah felt a strange flicker of emotion at that. The idea that Ethan, a man who noticed little outside of his own affairs, might see her in any way beyond her role as his housekeeper seemed almost impossible. Yet Lydia's words planted a tiny seed of confidence. Perhaps, just perhaps, Ethan saw her not as an outsider, but as someone capable, someone he could rely on beyond the daily routine of managing his home. By the time the clock struck 7, she made her way to the entrance, feeling the cool silk of the dress against her skin with each step, grounding her, reminding her to breathe. She had never felt more out of place, yet there was a strange exhilaration in the experience, a sense that she was stepping into a role she'd never expected to play. Ethan stood waiting, his tall figure cutting an imposing silhouette against the light. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, sharp and elegant, an ensemble that seemed crafted to match his aura of authority and control. When he turned to face her, his expression softened, just barely, as he took in her appearance. "Sarah," he murmured, and for a moment, his usual reserve faltered. His eyes lingered, taking in the way the emerald green of the dress complemented her, the delicate jewelry, her elegant posture. He cleared his throat and offered his arm. "Shall we?" She hesitated before taking his arm, feeling a jolt as their hands touched. It was just a simple, formal gesture, yet the feeling of his steady grip, the slight warmth radiating from him, sent a shiver down her spine. She had always seen him as a distant figure, a commanding presence in a world far from her own. But tonight, she was right beside him, stepping out into his world as though she belonged. The car ride was quiet, Ethan's gaze mostly focused outside the window as they drove through the city, the tall buildings glistening in the night. Sarah could feel the weight of her own thoughts, each moment stretching into silence that felt somehow charged. She glanced at him, his profile sharp and thoughtful, his mind clearly occupied by whatever lay ahead at the dinner. And yet, despite his usual detachment, he seemed subtly aware of her presence, his hand resting casually close to hers on the leather seat, a silent reassurance in his proximity. Finally, they pulled up to the restaurant, an opulent building with grand pillars and golden lights that illuminated the entrance. Ethan opened the door and stepped out, then turned to extend a hand to her. She took it, stepping onto the curb with a quiet intake of breath, her heart pounding as they approached the grand doors. Inside, the atmosphere was one of understated elegance, soft music filling the room, waitstaff moving seamlessly among the guests. The space buzzed with quiet conversations, glasses clinking, and low laughter from tables occupied by some of the most influential figures in the city. Sarah felt a momentary wave of panic, the sheer weight of the gathering pressing down on her. But Ethan's hand at her elbow steadied her, his voice low and calm. "Remember, you're here because I chose you," he murmured, his words meant only for her. "You belong here tonight, Sarah." She nodded, swallowing back her nervousness, feeling a renewed sense of purpose at his words. They walked together into the room, Ethan moving with his usual quiet authority, his presence commanding attention. Heads turned as they passed, curious gazes lingering on Sarah, some recognizing her unfamiliar face and assessing her with a mix of interest and skepticism. Ethan introduced her to a few prominent investors, his tone formal but respectful, always with a hint of pride that surprised her. He referred to her as "my longtime confidant," a phrase that sent a thrill and confusion through her. She caught more than one intrigued look from those around them, whispers exchanged quietly, as if trying to puzzle out her place in Ethan's life. But through it all, Sarah maintained her composure, keeping her voice steady, nodding politely, listening closely to the conversations around her. She was acutely aware of her appearance, the dress, the jewelry, every detail meticulously chosen for this world. Yet as the evening continued, she found herself easing into the role, drawing on years of observing Ethan, of understanding how he navigated these complex social waters with such ease. For the first time, she was more than an observer, more than the silent presence in his home. Tonight, she was by his side, someone whom he trusted enough to share this part of his life. And though she didn't know where this would lead, for the first time, Sarah felt as if she was crossing an invisible threshold, one that had kept her in the shadows for years. The night stretched on, but as she stood there, Sarah began to realize that this world, daunting and dazzling as it was, might not be so unattainable after all. And as the music drifted through the air, she couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead, as the boundary between employer and confidant grew fainter, melting into something she could neither predict nor control. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she and Ethan entered the heart of the dining hall. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations above the tables, casting a soft, opulent glow over everything. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved through the room, delivering glasses of sparkling champagne and plates arranged with meticulous precision. This was no ordinary restaurant. It was a theater of the elite, where every gesture, every word seemed carefully crafted to assert status and power. Sarah tried to keep her expression composed, but the magnitude of it all pressed down on her. Here, amidst the glittering elegance and whispered conversations, she felt painfully out of place, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong spot. She glanced down, hoping her nerves weren't showing, but her hands betrayed her, trembling just slightly against the smooth silk of her dress. As if sensing her discomfort, Ethan leaned in, his voice low and steady. "You're doing just fine," he murmured, his gaze reassuring. "Remember, all eyes may be on you, but you're here because I chose you to be." His words soothed her nerves like a balm, reminding her of her purpose tonight. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and met the gazes of those around her with quiet dignity. She wasn't merely the housekeeper tonight. She was someone he trusted, someone he valued enough to stand beside him in this rarefied world. They walked further into the room, and Sarah noticed heads turning, eyes trailing them as they passed. She wasn't sure if the stares were a result of her unfamiliar face or a product of sheer curiosity. After all, Ethan Collins was rarely seen with a companion. A few of the attendees wore expressions of mild surprise, as though they couldn't quite place her, while others glanced between her and Ethan, their looks filled with curiosity or quiet appraisal. One couple whispered to each other, their glances lingering on Sarah before they offered polite nods to Ethan. Sarah tried to ignore the feeling of being silently scrutinized, but her thoughts ran wild, wondering what assumptions they were making. Did they see her as a mere employee, a passing companion to fill a seat? Or was there something more to the way Ethan held himself beside her, the gentle but protective hand he placed at her back as they approached their table? When they reached their seats, Ethan introduced her to his small circle of associates. The group consisted of 3 influential investors, each with an air of power that matched Ethan's. There was Daniel Hargrove, a tall, silver-haired man with a steely gaze, Miriam Lawson, a refined woman with sharp eyes behind elegant glasses, and Thomas Blackwell, a slightly younger, charming man whose demeanor seemed more relaxed but was no less calculating. "Daniel, Miriam, Thomas. This is Sarah," Ethan said simply, his tone carrying a weight of familiarity that surprised her. "She's been by my side for quite some time." Each of them nodded politely, their eyes flickering with curiosity as they assessed her. Sarah sensed an unspoken question in their expressions, as though they couldn't quite reconcile her place here with Ethan's carefully constructed image. Still, they masked their surprise behind polite smiles and courteous nods, and Sarah returned their greetings, grateful that her voice didn't betray her unease. As the conversation began, she tried to remain as unobtrusive as possible, listening intently to the business jargon and the sharp, strategic exchanges between them. She was accustomed to hearing fragments of such conversations from the other side of a closed door, but tonight was different. Here, she was close enough to see the subtle shifts in expression, the flickers of tension, the silent exchanges of glances. While she focused on her role as a quiet observer, one of Ethan's business associates, Thomas, turned his attention directly to her. "So, Sarah," he began, a faint smile curving his lips. "What's it like to work alongside someone as driven as Ethan?" She felt her cheeks flush slightly, caught off guard by the question. She glanced at Ethan, whose expression remained composed, though his eyes held a subtle intensity, watching her response. "It's an experience," she replied carefully, searching for the right words. "Mr. Collins has a certain vision, a way of setting high expectations for everything around him." Miriam raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And I imagine that isn't always easy," she said, leaning forward with a curious glint in her eye. "Yet you've been with him for how long?" 15 years, Sarah replied, her voice growing steadier. She felt a surprising calm wash over her, a quiet confidence. "It's been challenging at times, yes, but it's also been rewarding, in its own way." Ethan's gaze softened, a hint of approval crossing his face. She had given them just enough, answering honestly without offering too much. It was clear they saw her as someone unexpected in his life, someone who defied the detached, professional distance they had always associated with him. For Ethan, this dinner was business as usual, but for Sarah, it felt like a delicate dance, a moment that demanded both poise and subtlety. A server approached with the first course, and as the plates were placed before them, conversation resumed among the investors, turning to industry trends and recent market developments. Sarah relaxed slightly, relieved to have the attention drift away from her, but her reprieve was short-lived. Daniel, the silver-haired investor, turned to Ethan, his voice a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "I must say, Ethan, your choice of company tonight is a bit of a departure from your usual crowd." Ethan gave a faint smile, his gaze flickering to Sarah with an expression that was almost tender, though it was masked quickly by his usual cool composure. "Sometimes a different perspective can be enlightening," he replied, his tone steady but meaningful. Sarah felt the weight of his words, and a sense of warmth spread through her, easing the tension in her shoulders. It was rare to hear him speak of anyone with such regard, and though she told herself not to read too much into it, the words seemed to linger in the air between them, quiet but profound. As the courses continued, Sarah found herself growing more comfortable, absorbing the nuances of each conversation, the flow of ideas, and the subtle strategies exchanged in every glance and word. And with each passing minute, she noticed Ethan's quiet attentiveness to her, the way he would glance at her, ensuring she felt included, despite her outsider status. In an unexpected lull between topics, Miriam turned to Sarah again, her eyes keen with a hint of mischief. "And what do you think of our little world, Sarah?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "The world of investments, of endless calculations, of deals behind closed doors." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's fascinating," she admitted honestly, her gaze meeting Miriam's. "But it's also relentless. A life where it seems that everyone's constantly playing a game, yet only a few seem to truly win." Ethan's lips curved into a slight smile at her words, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. His associates, too, seemed intrigued by her observation, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to genuine interest. "It seems Ethan's confidant has more insight than we expected," Thomas remarked with a light chuckle, raising his glass in a subtle toast to her. Sarah smiled, a surge of confidence filling her as she raised her own glass. For the first time that evening, she felt as though she truly belonged, not because of the dress or the jewelry, but because she had something to offer beyond appearances. As the dinner continued, she realized that she had crossed a threshold in Ethan's life. No longer was she merely the silent figure in the background. Tonight, she was someone of value, someone he trusted, someone who could stand by his side with dignity. And though she couldn't predict what this change would mean for her, the quiet thrill of being seen, not just by the people around them, but by Ethan himself, was enough to make her believe, for a fleeting moment, that perhaps she had a place in his world after all. As the evening unfolded, Sarah found herself unexpectedly drawn into the intricate web of conversation at the table. It was a world of high-stakes decisions, strategic alliances, and whispered secrets. But as she listened closely, she began to realize something unexpected. She understood far more than she'd anticipated. Ethan's business affairs had been woven into her life for years, and she had overheard countless fragments of his conversations, discussions on acquisitions, competitive analysis, and market shifts. Those years of quiet observance had given her a unique familiarity with his world, and tonight, that knowledge made her feel oddly prepared. As the main course arrived, a delicate dish of grilled fish with an aromatic herb sauce, Daniel Hargrove, a seasoned and calculating investor, leaned back, swirling his wine glass thoughtfully. His eyes turned toward Sarah, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Tell me, Sarah," he began, in a tone that was both casual and testing, "what's your perspective on the recent merger of Harrington Industries and Caltech? I imagine, being so close to Ethan, you must have overheard the impact of such a move." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. The merger Daniel referred to was a hot topic, one that Ethan had discussed with colleagues in the days leading up to the dinner. She had caught glimpses of his opinions on the matter, his skepticism about the long-term success of the merger given the stark cultural differences between the two companies. Ethan believed the partnership was built on shaky foundations, and he had said so privately, though with few details. She glanced at Ethan, catching a glimmer of encouragement in his gaze, as if daring her to speak her mind. Taking a small breath, she straightened in her seat and answered, careful but clear. "Well, if I may," she began, her voice calm but deliberate, "I think there are aspects of the merger that look promising on the surface. Caltech brings a robust portfolio of patents, and Harrington Industries has the global distribution reach to leverage them. However," she paused, choosing her words with care, "there's a concern, I believe, about how well those two cultures will integrate. Caltech has always been innovative and somewhat risk-averse, while Harrington Industries is more aggressive, less cautious. That sort of cultural clash can easily become a liability in the long run, don't you think?" Daniel raised his eyebrows, clearly taken aback. For a moment, an amused but impressed smile crossed his face. "That's quite insightful, Sarah," he remarked. "In fact, I'd say you're spot on. There's been plenty of chatter about how the cultures might clash, though it's something not everyone considers. You certainly seem to have an ear for business." Sarah gave a small smile, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap under the table, unseen. She couldn't deny that there was a thrill in being taken seriously, in seeing her observations resonate with people whose respect Ethan valued. But there was a part of her that remained cautious, uncertain of what would come from stepping so far outside her comfort zone. Miriam, who had been listening quietly, tilted her head with a look of genuine interest. "Sarah, you're a bit of a mystery. I wouldn't have expected someone from outside our world to pick up on these dynamics with such precision." Her tone was warm but probing. "How did you become so observant?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Ethan, whose expression was one of calm encouragement. "I suppose it comes from being around Mr. Collins for so long," she replied carefully. "When you're familiar with someone's habits and values, you start to understand their approach, even if it's not your world." Ethan's lips curled into a slight smile. It was clear that he appreciated her answer, but more than that, he seemed genuinely impressed. Sarah could feel his eyes on her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to look back at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet confidence she hadn't felt before. As the dinner continued, the conversation grew more animated, moving from one topic to another, with Sarah offering occasional insights that seemed to intrigue Ethan's colleagues. Thomas, the younger and more relaxed investor, took particular interest in her thoughts, sometimes laughing at her surprisingly shrewd observations, sometimes nodding with genuine respect. Toward the end of the evening, however, the discussion took a more serious turn. Daniel, who had grown increasingly curious about Sarah's insights, decided to test her. "So, Sarah," he said, his tone casual, but with an edge of challenge, "Ethan's been considering a potential acquisition in the renewable energy sector. A smart move, especially with all the recent government incentives. Tell me, what do you think about such a shift? Do you think it aligns with his core values?" The question was pointed, as if he were testing her loyalty, as well as her understanding of Ethan's principles. Sarah felt a sudden pressure settle over her. She hadn't expected to be drawn so deeply into this world, and Daniel's probing gaze made it clear that he was looking for more than a superficial answer. She glanced at Ethan, his face calm, though his eyes held a faint glimmer of something unreadable. Sarah gathered her thoughts, considering the nuances she had observed over the years. She had seen Ethan's measured approach, his insistence on long-term gains over quick profits, and his quiet interest in sustainable investments, though he rarely spoke about openly. "I think it's a natural fit for Mr. Collins," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. "He's always been focused on long-term value, on ventures that aren't just profitable, but have lasting impact. Renewable energy isn't just about trend, it's about the future. If he's considering it, then I believe it aligns perfectly with what he values most: stability and sustainable growth." A silence fell over the table as the investors took in her response. For a brief moment, Sarah feared she had overstepped, speaking so openly about Ethan's principles. But to her surprise, a satisfied smile crept over Daniel's face, and he nodded slowly. "Well said, Sarah." "Very well said," he replied, his tone respectful. "Ethan, it seems you have a confidant with remarkable insight." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but his gaze softened as he looked at her, a warmth in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "I've known that for a long time, Daniel," he replied simply, a hint of pride in his voice. Thomas laughed, raising his glass in a small toast to Sarah. "To Sarah, the unexpected star of the evening," he said with a grin. Everyone raised their glasses, and Sarah, though blushing, met their toast with a sense of quiet pride. She had proven herself in their eyes, not merely as a companion to Ethan, but as someone with an understanding that commanded respect. As the evening wound down, Sarah noticed the subtle glances between Ethan and his associates, the unspoken approval in their eyes. They recognized her not only as an observer, but as a trusted figure in Ethan's life, a person whose insights were valued. She couldn't deny the thrill this newfound role gave her, the sense that she was more than just a fixture in Ethan's world. When the dinner finally concluded and they rose from the table, Ethan offered her his arm again. This time, she took it with a newfound confidence, her heart swelling with an unspoken pride. They walked out together, her arm in his, leaving the hushed murmurs of approval and curiosity behind them. For the first time in years, Sarah felt as though she was emerging from the shadows, stepping into a place she had never dared to imagine. As they made their way back to the car, Ethan looked at her with a faint, unreadable smile. "You did more than well tonight, Sarah," he said softly. "I think you surprised us all, including me." She glanced at him, feeling her cheeks warm again under his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Collins," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to make sure I didn't disappoint you." He shook his head, his eyes holding hers with a sincerity that seemed almost vulnerable. "You never have, Sarah. And tonight, you were extraordinary." They settled into the car, the city lights casting fleeting reflections across the window as they drove in silence, each lost in thought. But for Sarah, that night marked a turning point, a step into a world she had never considered her own. And though she didn't know where this path would lead, she knew that something had shifted between her and Ethan and within herself. As they drove back to the mansion, Sarah's mind buzzed with the events of the evening. The dinner had been a test, a silent trial that she hadn't seen coming. She had faced down probing questions, curious stares, and the quiet, evaluating gazes of Ethan's most trusted associates, and somehow she had emerged unscathed, even triumphant. But the night was far from over. In the back of her mind, she felt a lingering tension, a strange undercurrent that she couldn't shake. Once they arrived at the mansion, the silence between her and Ethan seemed to take on a life of its own. They walked side by side through the darkened foyer, their footsteps echoing softly, and though neither of them spoke, an unspoken awareness pulsed between them. Sarah felt her cheeks flush again under his gaze as she remembered the subtle glances he'd given her throughout the evening, each one charged with a silent approval that both thrilled and unsettled her. She couldn't help but wonder if Ethan, too, was wrestling with his own thoughts, his usual stoicism disrupted by what had transpired tonight. "Thank you, Sarah," he said finally, his voice low, yet clear in the quiet space. "You handled yourself remarkably well tonight." Sarah turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I was nervous, I'll admit," she said, offering him a faint smile. "But being by your side made it easier." Ethan's expression softened, and he took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "You're more than you realize, Sarah," he murmured, his gaze unwavering. "I knew you'd be able to hold your own, but I underestimated how insightful you truly are." There was a vulnerability in his tone, a quiet sincerity that took her by surprise. The usual formality between them seemed to fade, leaving behind an openness that was as fragile as it was thrilling. They were no longer simply employer and housekeeper. They were two people standing on equal footing, both acutely aware of the delicate, shifting boundaries between them. "Mr. Collins," she began, her voice catching slightly, but she didn't finish. She didn't have the words for what she was feeling, the strange connection that had been building all evening. But Ethan seemed to understand. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, neither willing to break the silence. Just then, a distant chime echoed through the hall, snapping them both back to reality. Sarah stepped back, breaking the gaze, her cheeks flushing as she remembered where she was, the mansion's grandeur suddenly pressing in around her. I should be getting back," she said, her voice barely steady. "There's work to be done in the morning." Ethan gave a small nod, his expression unreadable once more. "Yes, of course," he replied, though his voice was softer, his usual composed mask slipping ever so slightly. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Mr. Collins." As she turned to walk back to her quarters, Sarah felt an unspoken pull, a tension between them that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the night had created a bridge, one that connected their lives in ways she had never imagined. Yet, despite the thrill of this new connection, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. There were still walls between them, walls built over years of distance, of expectation, of roles that were never meant to overlap. The following day, Sarah felt the effects of the night linger in everything she did. She moved through her tasks with an unusual energy, her mind replaying the moments from the dinner over and over. But wasn't long before the memories of the evening collided with reality, bringing her back to her role in the mansion, the routines she had established, the boundaries that felt both comforting and confining. As she dusted the grand staircase, she heard voices drifting from Ethan's study, low, tense, and unmistakably in disagreement. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she moved closer, keeping a respectful distance, but catching snippets of the conversation. "I don't need to justify my decisions to anyone." Ethan's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. "I know exactly what I'm doing." "Ethan, it's not a question of justification," came Daniel's voice, firm and insistent. "It's a question of image. Last night, everyone was asking who she was. Your image is everything in this world, and people talk. They're already speculating. I couldn't care less about their speculation." Ethan shot back, his tone clipped, a rare flash of impatience in his voice. "Sarah is someone I trust. That should be enough." Sarah's heart pounded as she listened, her fingers tightening around the dust cloth in her hand. She knew she shouldn't be hearing this, but she was caught in the tension of the moment, unable to turn away. Ethan's words, his unusual defensiveness, stirred something within her, an unexpected warmth, mingled with a strange fear. "You may not care, but you should," Daniel insisted. "You have a reputation, Ethan. You know how." Quickly rumors spread, how the smallest misstep can be blown out of proportion. Ethan's response was immediate, his voice steady but colder than Sarah had ever heard it. "If they can't accept my choices, then they're welcome to walk away. I won't be dictated by their petty gossip." A heavy silence followed, and Sarah felt her heart sink. She knew what was at stake in Ethan's world. Reputation was everything, and the people around him would scrutinize every move, every decision. For him to stand against them so strongly, for her sake, was a gesture she hadn't expected. And yet, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for causing him trouble. She backed away, her footsteps silent on the polished floor, slipping away before the conversation could reveal more. She returned to her duties, her mind swirling with thoughts, questions, emotions she couldn't quite name. Had her presence at the dinner really caused so much turmoil? She hadn't considered the impact her being there might have on Ethan, on his position among his peers. Later that evening, she was preparing tea when Ethan entered the kitchen. He was quiet, his face thoughtful, his usual composed expression touched by a hint of something more vulnerable. He watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice calm but with an intensity that surprised her. "Sarah, about last night," he began, then hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I know there are things being said, people questioning my choices." She met his gaze, the warmth in his eyes filling her with a strange courage. "I overheard part of your conversation with Mr. Hargrove," she admitted softly, her voice steady. "I didn't mean to cause you any trouble, Mr. Collins. I never intended to complicate things for you." Ethan shook his head, his gaze never leaving hers. "You didn't, Sarah. None of this is your fault. If anything, it's my own doing." He paused, his jaw tightening briefly, as if wrestling with some unspoken thought. "I chose to bring you there because I trusted you. You deserve that trust, and anyone who doubts that isn't someone I need to listen to." Her heart swelled, both touched and pained by his words. She could see the toll this was taking on him, the quiet conflict he kept hidden beneath his calm exterior. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if it's too much, if my presence is causing problems for you, I understand if—" "Sarah, stop," he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I've spent years surrounded by people who only see my position, my wealth. Very few see anything beyond that." He paused, his gaze holding hers with a fierce sincerity. "You do." The words hung between them, filling the air with a raw, unspoken intimacy. She looked away, her cheeks flushing, her hands trembling slightly as she busied herself with the tea tray. She didn't know what to say, the weight of his admission leaving her breathless. As she turned back to him, she saw the slightest hint of a smile on his face, the faintest crack in his otherwise unyielding demeanor. It was a glimpse of the man she had only imagined he could be, a man capable of warmth, of vulnerability, of quiet strength. And in that moment, she knew that the boundary between them had shifted irrevocably. Without another word, he nodded, leaving her alone in the kitchen, the tension between them humming in the silence. And as Sarah watched him disappear down the hallway, she realized that her life, once so neatly confined within her role, had opened to a world of impossible choices and undeniable emotions. She didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: she couldn't go back to the way things had been. The following day dawned with a quiet intensity hanging in the air, an unspoken tension that had settled between Sarah and Ethan since the dinner. As she moved about the house, her mind replayed their conversation in the kitchen, the way he had looked at her with that rare, open vulnerability, his words echoing in her thoughts. "You see beyond all of this." It was a strange sensation, one she couldn't shake, a mixture of thrill, confusion, and fear. For 15 years, she had kept herself at a careful distance, faithfully adhering to the boundaries of her role. But in a few short days, that distance had been breached, and she felt herself drawn closer to a man she thought she'd understood, only to realize that she had barely known him at all. That evening, as she prepared to retire to her quarters, she heard Ethan's voice calling her name softly down the hall. "Sarah, could I speak with you for a moment?" She turned to find him standing at the end of the hallway, his figure silhouetted by the warm light spilling from his study. His expression was thoughtful, and there was a quiet urgency in his gaze. Sarah felt her heart quicken, the familiarity of her surroundings somehow feeling foreign as she approached him. "Yes, Mr. Collins," she replied, her voice soft, careful. "Please," he said, his tone gentle, almost vulnerable. "Tonight, just call me Ethan." The request startled her. For as long as she'd known him, He had been Mr. Collins, a title that maintained the formality he preferred, a wall that kept his personal life carefully distanced from his public image. But tonight, he was asking her to step past that wall into a space where few, if any, had ever been invited. "Ethan," she echoed quietly, the word foreign on her tongue, yet strangely comforting. He gestured for her to join him in his study, and she followed him in, noticing the slight hesitation in his steps as though he, too, were crossing an invisible line. She looked around, taking in the room she rarely entered. It was more personal than the rest of the mansion, with shelves lined with leather-bound books and a large, mahogany desk scattered with papers and handwritten notes, a rare glimpse into the man behind the carefully crafted image. Ethan leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms in a way that was both relaxed and reserved, his gaze steady on her. After a long moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." He paused, his expression contemplative, as though searching for the right words. "Last night, after the dinner, it became clear to me that there's more at stake than just my reputation." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, the tension between them mounting. She took a small, steadying breath, her gaze fixed on him as he continued. "I've built my life around being unapproachable," he said, his voice quieter. "I wanted to keep everyone at arm's length, to stay untouchable. It made things simpler." He looked away, as if embarrassed by his own admission. "But lately, that distance has become hollow." He hesitated, his fingers tapping absently against the desk, and Sarah realized she was holding her breath. She had never seen him like this, open, exposed, unguarded. For a man who had spent his life behind walls of composure and reserve, his vulnerability felt like a fragile, precious thing, something he was offering her with the faintest hint of uncertainty. "You're the only person who's seen past it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And somehow, that's both terrifying and liberating. Sarah's heart swelled, a surge of emotions rising within her that she could barely contain. She wanted to speak, to reach out, to tell him that she, too, had felt the same pull, the same confusing blend of attraction and fear that had stirred within her since the night at the restaurant. But words failed her, and for a moment, all she could do was look at him, her gaze filled with the quiet longing she had hidden for so long. "Ethan, she began, her voice faltering. She glanced away, gathering her courage before meeting his eyes again. "I never expected any of this. I came to work for you because I needed a job, a purpose. I never thought I'd become important to you." He took a step closer, the distance between them narrowing. "You've been more than important, Sarah," he said softly, his gaze intense. "In a world where everything feels like a transaction, you've been real. I've never had to question your loyalty, your honesty, and that's something I can't ignore anymore." Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling around her. She had spent years living a life that was structured, simple, predictable. She had never dared to imagine anything beyond her role, her quiet presence in his world. But now, that world felt strangely incomplete without him, and the thought of stepping away felt like tearing a piece of herself free. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, "I don't know if I belong in your world. I've spent years convincing myself that I don't, but it's becoming harder to keep that distance." His eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing through them. "Then maybe," he murmured, his voice as gentle as she'd ever heard it, "it's time we stopped pretending there has to be distance between us." Without thinking, she took a small step forward, her hand reaching out instinctively, her fingers brushing against his. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt like a declaration, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that had been building between them. She saw the tension leave his face, his gaze warming, softening in a way that made her feel both safe and exposed. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, their hands barely touching, the warmth of his skin sending a thrill through her. She felt her heart pounding, her mind racing with unspoken possibilities, questions, fears. But for once, she didn't want answers, didn't want to analyze the moment. She just wanted to be here, with him, without the weight of roles, expectations, or the world pressing in around them. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan spoke, his voice soft, hesitant. "Sarah, whatever this is between us, it doesn't have to be something we explain. It doesn't have to be anything more than what it is." She nodded, a small smile breaking through her uncertainty. "Maybe that's enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, as if drawn by an unspoken understanding, he closed the distance between them, his hand resting gently on her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. She felt herself leaning into his touch, her eyes closing as the warmth of his presence wrapped around her, comforting and exhilarating all at once. Their breaths mingled in the quiet of the study, the sounds of the mansion fading into nothingness. She opened her eyes, finding his gaze steady on hers, filled with a tenderness she had only dreamed he could possess. In that moment, they stood on the edge of something vast and uncharted, a new world of possibility opening before them. Whatever lay ahead, be it more tension, scrutiny, or the complexity of navigating a relationship they'd both fought to ignore, it didn't matter. For now, they had this moment, a shared understanding, a quiet promise that they would face it together. And as he pulled her into a gentle embrace, the walls around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, standing at the beginning of a story they hadn't dared to write. The days that followed carried an unmistakable shift between Sarah and Ethan. Though their routines remained unchanged, the atmosphere in the mansion felt charged with a new energy. They moved with an ease they hadn't before, a quiet understanding in each passing glance, each shared moment. It was a silent dance, one neither acknowledged openly, yet both understood was unfolding with each day. Ethan found himself wandering into spaces where Sarah worked, his footsteps slow and quiet, his presence lingering just enough to draw her attention. Sometimes he'd stand at the kitchen entrance, asking her opinion on mundane details he'd normally never notice. "Do you prefer tea or coffee in the morning?" he asked one day, watching her with quiet curiosity, as if these small preferences of hers were mysteries worth unraveling. "Tea," she replied with a soft smile, surprised by the question. "Coffee's too strong for me." He nodded thoughtfully, as though committing this small detail to memory, and she felt her heart flutter, realizing he was noticing her in a way he never had before. The quiet intimacy grew between them, shaping each interaction, each quiet word exchanged, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt the walls around her begin to soften. She knew it was risky, knew that whatever was building between them couldn't remain a secret forever. Yet, she couldn't deny the warmth it brought, the thrill of knowing that Ethan was seeing her as more than the quiet woman who kept his house in order. One evening, after most of the staff had retired for the night, Ethan asked her to join him for a late dinner in the sunroom. The sun had set, casting the room in soft shadows, and the only light came from the warm glow of candles on the table. Sarah hesitated at first, feeling the boundaries of their relationship blurring once more, but Ethan's gentle smile, the invitation in his eyes, reassured her. "I thought you might like some time away from the usual," he said quietly, his gaze lingering on her face. She nodded, and they settled at the table, the quiet hum of the evening filling the space between them. As they ate, Ethan asked her about her life before the mansion, a question that took her by surprise, considering he'd never once asked about her personal life. "What did you do before you came to work here?" he asked, his tone light, yet genuinely curious. Sarah smiled softly, a hint of nostalgia in her eyes. "I had a simpler life. I worked as a housekeeper for a small family before this, in a little town upstate. It was different, quiet, no one to impress. But when they move away, I needed something new." And then, she paused, glancing around the elegant room. "Then I came here." Ethan's gaze was warm, attentive, and she felt a strange comfort in sharing pieces of herself with him. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I've made a life here. It became home. Somehow," Ethan's expression softened. "You know, Sarah, This place wouldn't be the same without you. It's more than a mansion. It's because of you that it feels like a home." He paused, as though caught off guard by his own honesty. "I never really had that before." A silence fell over them, thick with unspoken feelings. Sarah could feel her heart race as she looked into his eyes, knowing that they were crossing yet another threshold, each moment drawing them closer to a place from which they couldn't return. She took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. She had always thought of herself as the quiet presence in his life, but to hear him say that she had transformed his world into a home, a place of comfort, of belonging, it felt like a gift she hadn't realized she had been giving him all along. But just as they both seemed to relax into this shared warmth, a movement from the doorway caught Sarah's eye. She looked up to see Lydia, one of the younger housemaids, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise as she took in the intimate scene before her. "Oh, Lydia stammered, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you might need something, Mr. Collins." I'll leave you too." She vanished as quickly as she had appeared, but her presence lingered, casting a sudden, harsh light on the private moment between them. Sarah felt a chill run through her, the warmth of their conversation shattered by the reality of their positions, the reminder of the roles that defined them in the eyes of others. Ethan looked at her, his face tense, clearly sensing her discomfort. "Sarah," but she shook her head, forcing a small smile. It's all right, Mr. Collins," she replied, her voice a whisper. "I think I should get back to my quarters. I don't want to overstep." "Sarah, please." He reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "Don't let one moment change this. We both know this is more than just a job, more than roles." She wanted to believe him, wanted to stay by his side, but the weight of reality pressed down on her. It was easy to fall into the comfort of their private world, but outside of it, there were eyes, whispers, and judgments that would always remind her of the boundaries they were crossing. "Ethan," she whispered, her heart aching. Whatever this is, it's not something we can just pretend won't change things. People will notice. They'll talk." He nodded, his eyes holding a sadness she hadn't seen before. "I know, but I also know that I'm willing to face whatever comes of this. Are you?" Sarah held his gaze, the depth of his sincerity leaving her speechless. She wanted to say yes, to reach out and close the distance between them once and for all. But even as she longed to be with him, she knew that the path they were contemplating would be far from simple. A single, vulnerable moment in the sunroom was one thing, but to take a step toward a life together, where the world would question and judge her, where she would stand out as a glaring anomaly in his life, that was a reality she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. "I need time," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her own fears. "I need to think about what all of this means." He nodded, his expression unreadable but understanding. "Take all the time you need, Sarah," he replied, his voice quiet yet steady. "I'll be here." With a small, trembling smile, she slipped her hand from his and left the sunroom, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She walked through the halls, her mind racing, her heart heavy with the conflict between longing and fear. Her life had been simple, predictable, carefully structured. But now, a world of impossible choices stretched before her, a world where she could either protect the life she knew or risk it all for a chance at something beyond her wildest dreams. Back in her quarters, she sat in the dim light, her hands clasped tightly, her thoughts a whirlwind. She wanted to believe in the quiet promise she had seen in Ethan's eyes, the warmth of his presence that had made her feel, for the first time, that she truly belonged. But the reality of their situation weighed heavily on her. The knowledge that their connection would be scrutinized, criticized, and questioned by the world outside their secluded mansion. And as she sat in the quiet of her room, Sarah found herself torn between two lives: the safe, familiar world she had always known, and the exhilarating, terrifying unknown that lay with Ethan, just a few steps away. The decision loomed before her, each path promising both fulfillment and sacrifice, and she knew that whatever choice she made, nothing would ever be the same. Over the next few days, Sarah and Ethan fell into a delicate rhythm, each of them navigating the fragile balance between their connection and the reality of their lives. There was a new energy in the mansion, an awareness that hung between them, felt in each quiet moment they shared, in each gaze that lingered just a bit too long. Yet they both danced around it, careful not to push too far, each step cautious, but filled with an undercurrent of anticipation. It was late one evening, with a gentle rain tapping against the windows, that Sarah found herself lingering in the library, lost in thought as she glanced over the shelves. She had always found comfort in the library's stillness, its rich sense of leather and wood, and the history embedded in every book. But tonight, her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts drifting to Ethan, to the unspoken feelings that had filled the space between them. Couldn't sleep either. Ethan's voice broke the silence, and Sarah turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, his expression soft, a faint smile playing at his lips. She gave him a shy smile, her heart pounding at his unexpected presence. "No, I was just thinking," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped into the room, his footsteps quiet on the thick carpet as he moved closer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, filled with all the words they hadn't dared to say. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low and steady. "Sarah, I can't pretend anymore," he murmured, his eyes intense as they met hers. "Whatever this is between us, it's more than friendship, more than companionship. I don't know how else to say it, except that I want you by my side, not just in the house, but in my life." Sarah's breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her. She felt a surge of emotions, joy, fear, disbelief, all fighting for space in her heart. She had always told herself that this connection was fleeting, a product of circumstance, something that would pass once they both returned to their roles. But here he was, breaking down every wall, every boundary she had put up to keep herself from falling too deeply. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm ready for what that would mean. This life, your life, it's not easy. People would never accept me." He reached out, taking her hand in his grip warm and reassuring. "Sarah, I've spent my life caring too much about what people think, about image, about power, about being seen as untouchable." His eyes softened, a quiet vulnerability shining through. "But none of that matters if I don't have someone who sees beyond it all." She looked at him, feeling the tears prick her eyes as his words washed over her. It was everything she'd wanted to hear, yet everything she feared. To be with him would mean stepping into a life that was far from the quiet simplicity she'd built for herself. It would mean facing judgment, scrutiny, and possibly losing the very sense of comfort she'd found in her role. But looking into his eyes, she felt a warmth, a safety, and a promise that whispered of something beautiful and rare. "Ethan, I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared of losing myself in a world where I don't belong." He took a step closer, his hand lifting to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "Then, let's create our own world," he murmured, his gaze filled with a gentle strength. "One where we make our own rules, our own path." She searched his eyes, finding nothing but sincerity and patience, a quiet understanding that calmed her fears. In that moment, all the uncertainties faded, leaving only the feeling of his hand in hers, his warmth, his closeness. She could feel her heart pounding, each beat a silent reminder that she was on the edge of something beautiful, something rare. And as if drawn by an unspoken force, she closed the distance between them, her heart racing as she leaned into him, her lips meeting his in a soft, tentative kiss. It was a gentle, hesitant gesture, but in it was the promise of everything they hadn't dared to say aloud. His arms wrapped around her, holding her close as he deepened the kiss, their shared warmth and quiet longing melting away the boundaries they had once so carefully maintained. The world around them faded, leaving only the two of them, bound by a connection that defied logic, defied their roles, defied everything that should have kept them apart. In his embrace, Sarah felt a peace she had never known, a quiet joy that filled her with hope. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges, with whispers, with the judgment of those who would never understand. But with Ethan by her side, she felt ready to face it all, to build a life that was theirs, beyond the expectations of the world around them. They pulled away slowly, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. There was no need for words, no need for promises. They both knew what lay ahead, and yet, in each other's arms, they felt a strength that gave them courage. For the first time, Sarah felt that her life, so long bound by routine and expectations, had opened to something boundless, something daring and full of promise. And as they stood together in the quiet of a library, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by a love that had quietly bloomed from the shadows. Let me know if this romantic development aligns with your vision for the story and if you'd like to proceed with part 11. The following days passed like a dream for Sarah. She and Ethan shared stolen moments, quiet conversations, and gentle touches as they navigated the new, fragile path they had begun together. But the peace between them was fleeting, and the weight of the world outside their sanctuary soon pressed in, demanding its due. It was at a grand corporate gala that the news broke, a formal event Ethan couldn't avoid attending. It was a night of glamour, attended by the most influential figures in finance and business, all eager to strengthen alliances and share whispers of emerging power moves. But tonight, there was a new, unexpected topic on everyone's lips. Ethan arrived at the event with Sarah on his arm, her presence a quiet, yet bold announcement to those who had gathered. The crowd parted as they entered, a wave of murmurs rippling through the guests as they realized who stood beside him. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and whispers erupted like wildfire. "Who is she?" One woman in an extravagant gown muttered to her husband, her gaze fixed on Sarah. "She's his housekeeper, isn't she?" Came a stunned reply from a man nearby. "What is she doing here?" Sarah felt the weight of their eyes on her, the curious and judgmental stares that trailed her every step. The murmurs grew louder as they walked further into the hall, each glance a silent question, each whisper a quiet accusation. She kept her head high, her hand on Ethan's arm, but inside, her heart pounded, and she could feel the fear rising. Ethan, sensing her discomfort, leaned in close, his voice calm but firm. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They don't know you like I do. They never will." She nodded, grateful for his reassurance, but the tension was unavoidable. She knew that in their eyes, she didn't belong here. She was an outsider, a curiosity, an enigma that didn't fit into their well-defined world. As the evening wore on, the scrutiny became more overt. Some attendees approached Ethan, their greetings cold, their smiles thin and insincere, while others made no attempt to hide their judgment. A tall, silver-haired man, one of Ethan's longtime associates, approached them with a look of polite disbelief. "Ethan," he said, offering a tight-lipped smile, "it's surprising to see you here with a new face. And may I ask, who is your companion tonight?" Ethan's arm tightened around Sarah's, and he met the man's gaze with quiet authority. "This is Sarah," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "She's my partner. I'm proud to be here with her." The words hung heavily in the air, and the man blinked, clearly taken aback. He struggled to hide his shock, but his smile faltered, the disbelief in his eyes impossible to mask. "I see," he replied stiffly, his eyes flickering toward Sarah with a poorly concealed skepticism. "Well, enjoy your evening." As he walked away, Sarah felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The whispers grew louder, the glances colder, and she could feel herself shrinking under the weight of their judgment. She felt Ethan's hand move to the small of her back, his presence steady and comforting, but the walls of the glamorous ballroom seemed to close in around her, the scrutiny an unbearable pressure. Just as she felt she could take no more, a woman approached her, a tall, elegant figure with dark hair and sharp, assessing eyes. She wore a gown that shimmered under the light, her posture poised and self-assured. "Sarah, is it?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of amusement. "You've certainly caused a stir tonight." Sarah met her gaze, her heart pounding, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Yes, that seems to be the case," she replied, her voice steady, though her nerves trembled beneath the surface. The woman's lips curved into a smile, though it was one devoid of warmth. "I imagine this must be quite a change for you," she said, her tone condescending. "Moving from the role of housekeeper to, well, whatever this is." Ethan stepped forward, his expression cold and protective, but Sarah raised a hand, signaling him to let her speak. She met the woman's gaze directly, her voice calm but firm. "You're right," Sarah replied evenly. "It is a change, but change can be a good thing. Just because I don't come from this world doesn't mean I don't belong in it." A flicker of surprise crossed the woman's face, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. But before she could respond, Ethan spoke, his voice filled with quiet authority. "Sarah belongs here because I chose her," he said, his gaze hardening. "And I would ask that you respect that." The woman's expression soured, but she said nothing more, turning away with a haughty lift of her chin. Sarah felt a surge of relief, but also a pang of shame, as if she were still somehow out of place, despite Ethan's support. The evening wore on, with more glances, more whispers, and Sarah could feel her confidence waning with each passing hour. Finally, as the night drew to a close, Sarah excused herself, slipping out to the balcony for a moment alone. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling tension inside, and she took a deep breath, closing her eyes as she tried to steady herself. Moments later, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Ethan standing there, his expression soft but filled with worry. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Sarah forced a small smile, though her heart felt heavy. "I knew it would be hard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't realize how humiliating it would feel. The way they look at me, the way they talk about me, as if I'm nothing but a passing fancy, a novelty." Ethan's face darkened, a quiet anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "You are far more than that, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "I don't care what they think. I brought you here because you belong by my side, not as some temporary arrangement, but as my partner. And if they can't accept that, then it's their problem, not ours." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also a lingering sadness. "But can you really ignore them, Ethan? The whispers, the judgment. This is your world, and I don't want to be the reason people look at you differently, the reason they question your choices." He took her hands in his gaze intense, unwavering. "Sarah, I spent years building a life that was perfect on the outside, but empty within. You changed that. You brought meaning to it. And if being with you means facing a few whispers, a few stares, then so be it. I'd choose that 1,000 times over if it means I get to be with you." Her heart swelled at his words, the sincerity in his voice filling her with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She felt the doubts fade, replaced by a quiet determination, a belief that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they stood in silence for a moment, their hands entwined, the city lights casting a soft glow over them. And as they looked out over the skyline, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her, a peace that made the whispers, the stares, and the judgment seem insignificant. In that moment, she realized that their love, unexpected and fragile as it was worth every challenge, every sacrifice. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "Then let's face it together," she whispered, her voice steady. "Whatever comes, whatever they say, I'm with you, Ethan." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as he held her tightly, a quiet promise between them. The world outside might never understand, might never accept what they had found in each other, but in his embrace, Sarah felt a strength that made her believe they could endure anything. As they stood together on the balcony, the city stretching out before them, they knew that their path would be filled with challenges. But they also knew that they would face it all, side by side, with a love that had been forged in the quiet spaces between them, strong enough to withstand the world's scrutiny. After the gala, rumors circulated faster than Sarah and Ethan could have anticipated. Headlines popped up in business journals, gossip columns speculated, and social media buzzed with questions about the mysterious woman who had accompanied Ethan Collins to one of the year's most prestigious events. Sarah became the subject of countless speculative articles, labeled everything from the housekeeper turned socialite to an enigmatic distraction. Back at the mansion, Sarah tried to ignore the onslaught of attention, but she couldn't escape the tension that followed her everywhere she went. The other household staff, who had always treated her with warmth and respect, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and caution, as if unsure how to address her. Despite Ethan's reassurances, Sarah felt the pressure building within her, a heavy weight that made it hard to focus, hard to breathe. Days passed in a haze of discomfort and self-doubt, each headline and whisper chipping away at the quiet confidence she had only just begun to find. Then one evening, after dinner, Ethan found her in the library. She had been avoiding him, retreating to her room, keeping her distance even as her heart longed to feel his comfort, his strength. But tonight, Ethan wasn't letting her withdraw. "Sarah," he said softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." She looked up, her face pale, her eyes troubled. "Ethan, she began, but he stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No, please," he said, his voice tender but insistent. "Let me speak." He led her to the sofa near the window, where the moonlight spilled across the carpet. They sat in silence for a moment, and she looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously in her lap. Ethan reached out, covering her hands with his touch steady and warm. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "And I know that my world can be harsh, unforgiving. But Sarah, you don't have to face this alone." She bit her lip, her emotions finally breaking through. "But it's your world, Ethan. You're accustomed to the scrutiny, the judgment. I'm not. They don't see me as someone worthy of being with you. I see it in their eyes, in their words. They think I'm an intruder." Ethan's face darkened, a fierce protectiveness flashing in his eyes. "And you believe that you're unworthy?" Her voice trembled as she answered. "I don't know. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes I feel like I'm risking everything I've built, my dignity, my peace, just to be with you. And I worry. I worry that one day you'll look at me the way they do." Ethan took a deep breath, his hand tightening around hers. "Sarah, listen to me. I've made mistakes. I've let the opinions of others shape too much of my life. But this," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "what we have, this isn't about them. It's about us. If I let their opinions dictate my happiness, then I'd be sacrificing the only thing that has ever brought meaning to my life." Sarah met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any flicker of hesitation. But all she saw was the fierce sincerity she had come to rely on, the quiet determination that had drawn her to him in the first place. "I know that judgment hurts, Sarah," he continued, his voice softer now. "And I know that what I'm asking you isn't easy. But I believe in us. I believe in you. And I am prepared to defend what we have, no matter what it costs." Her eyes filled with tears, the vulnerability of his words breaking down the final walls around her heart. She felt a mixture of relief and fear, a quiet terror that came with loving someone as powerful and public as Ethan. But she also felt a strength she hadn't known was there, a strength born from his faith in her, from the love they had forged despite the odds. But before she could respond, a soft knock on the library door interrupted them. They both turned to see Daniel Hargrove, Ethan's longtime friend and business partner, standing in the doorway. His face was grave, his expression unreadable as he glanced between them. "Ethan," Daniel said, his voice steady but tense. "I need to speak with you, privately." Ethan looked at Sarah, his gaze silently asking if she was all right, and she nodded, offering him a small, reassuring smile. He rose to his feet, turning to face Daniel, his posture straight and unyielding. "What is it, Daniel?" Ethan asked, his tone formal. Daniel hesitated, glancing at Sarah, his expression conflicted. "This concerns the recent developments between you and Sarah," he said slowly, his gaze hardening. "I'm speaking as a friend, Ethan, and as someone who has watched you build everything you have today." Ethan crossed his arms, his stance defensive. "Go on." Daniel took a step closer, his face a mixture of concern and frustration. "You have a reputation, Ethan. One that took years to build. One that's made you one of the most respected figures in our industry. But now people are talking. They're questioning your judgment. Investors are worried about the distractions. The whispers, the headlines. They're starting to erode your credibility." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his gaze steady on Daniel. "I'm saying this because I care, Ethan," Daniel continued, his voice firm. "Sarah is a lovely woman, but her presence in your life is raising eyebrows. You're risking everything, your career, your legacy, for a relationship that, to many, seems unsuitable." Sarah's heart sank, each word a painful reminder of the world she had stepped into. She felt the sting of Daniel's judgment, the confirmation of her deepest fears. But before she could react, Ethan spoke, his voice calm but filled with quiet anger. "Daniel, I understand your concerns," he said slowly, his tone measured. "But if you think I'd let the opinions of people who don't know Sarah dictate my life, then you don't know me as well as you think." Daniel's face hardened, his frustration clear. "I know you, Ethan. I know the weight you carry, the responsibilities you uphold. This isn't just about you. It's about the reputation we've built, the future we've worked for." Ethan took a step forward, his gaze intense. "The future I want is one where I don't have to sacrifice my happiness to please others. Sarah is part of that future, whether the world approves or not." Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched, his hands tense at his sides. He seemed to struggle with his next words, his expression conflicted. Finally, he turned back to Ethan, his voice low. "Then you've made your choice," he said quietly, his tone filled with resignation. "But don't expect everyone else to understand." With that, Daniel turned and walked out of the library, leaving Ethan and Sarah standing in silence. The weight of the confrontation lingered, filling the room with a heavy stillness. Sarah looked up at Ethan, her heart pounding, her mind racing with the implications of Daniel's words. Ethan reached for her hand, his gaze softening as he pulled her close. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet sorrow. "I know this isn't easy, but I can't let go of us. Not now, not ever." She wrapped her arms around him, her head resting on his shoulder as she held him tightly, feeling the depth of his love, his commitment. She knew that the path they were on would be fraught with challenges, with judgment, with the loss of allies who couldn't understand the choice he had made. But she also knew that his love was worth every sacrifice, every hardship. Together, they stood in the quiet of a library, holding each other as the world around them threatened to pull them apart. And in that embrace, they found a strength that made them ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united, determined, and unbreakable. The confrontation with Daniel marked a turning point. The tension was undeniable, but so was Ethan's resolve. News of their relationship had spread like wildfire, and the pressure on both of them grew with each passing day. Ethan knew that this wasn't something they could handle quietly anymore. A choice had to be made, a line drawn. He was done hiding, done with secrecy. He wanted to face the world openly, with Sarah by his side. 3 days after Daniel's visit, Ethan called a press conference. He told Sarah about his decision, and she had tried to convince him to reconsider, fearing the backlash, but he remained firm. "They need to hear it from me," he'd said gently, his gaze unwavering. "I won't let them doubt my choice, or you." The conference was held in a grand hotel in the city, and by the time they arrived, the room was filled with journalists, photographers, and industry professionals, all eager for the story that had captivated the public eye. Sarah felt a wave of anxiety rise as they approached the podium, the intensity of the crowd overwhelming. She could feel every gaze on her, every whisper, every flicker of judgment in the room, but Ethan's steady hand at her back was a quiet, constant reassurance. As they stepped up together, Ethan took her hand in his, a bold, undeniable gesture that left no room for speculation. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, immortalizing the defiance and strength in his stance, the quiet bravery in her eyes. Ethan took a breath, his gaze sweeping across the room before he spoke, his voice strong and unwavering. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone firm, his eyes calm yet resolute. "I understand that there has been significant speculation regarding my personal life these past few weeks. Many have questioned my choices, my decisions, and, frankly, my judgment. But I am here today to put those questions to rest." He glanced at Sarah, a quiet strength in his gaze. "The woman standing beside me is Sarah. She is my partner, my confidant, and the person I trust above anyone else in this world." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Ethan's focus never wavered. "I know some of you may struggle to understand this choice. Sarah doesn't come from my world, and she has no interest in the wealth or power that many of you may assume. What she brings to my life is something far more valuable than money, status, or reputation. She brings meaning. She brings honesty." He paused, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability. "For years, I lived in a world where I believed that power was the only thing that mattered, that wealth was the ultimate measure of success. But Sarah taught me something I could never have learned in boardrooms or banks. She taught me the value of love, of loyalty, of seeing beyond the walls I built to protect myself." A hush fell over the room, every eye fixed on him, on them. Sarah felt her heart pounding, his words resonating in her, filling her with a mixture of pride and awe. Ethan continued, his voice softening as he looked at her. "I won't ask the world to accept her or us. I only ask that you respect her. Respect her strength, her grace, and the incredible character she brings to my life. I would not be the man I am today without her, and I will not let the opinions of others undermine the happiness we have found together." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd, the flash of cameras momentarily forgotten as the journalists watched, captivated by the sincerity of his declaration. Then, a voice broke through the silence, a journalist, bold and direct. "Mr. Collins," he called out, raising his microphone. "Given your public image and your position, do you really think this relationship can last? Aren't you concerned about the impact on your reputation, your company's future?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but his grip on Sarah's hand remained steady. He looked the journalist directly in the eye, his gaze calm but fierce. "I am prepared to face any consequence that comes my way. My company, my reputation. None of it is worth sacrificing my happiness or the person I love." He paused, his voice lowering, but with an intensity that filled the room. "I am more than just my career, and Sarah is worth any challenge we may face. I would rather lose everything I've built than lose her." Another murmur rose in the crowd, this time tinged with a note of respect. Ethan's words carried a weight that even the most cynical journalist couldn't dismiss. Sarah felt a quiet strength bloom within her fears melting away in the warmth of his words, the certainty of his commitment. When the conference ended, they left the room together, the murmurs and flashes of cameras following them as they walked hand in hand. Ethan's grip was steady, his resolve unshakable, and in that moment, Sarah knew that he had meant every word. They were no longer hiding, no longer bending to the expectations of others. They were ready to face the world, united and unbreakable. In the days that followed, the world's reaction was divided. Some praised Ethan for his courage, for his willingness to defy the norms of his world, while others criticized him, accusing him of recklessness, of risking everything for the sake of a woman they deemed unworthy. The headlines varied, the opinions polarized, but Ethan remained steadfast, his quiet strength a constant reassurance in the storm of judgment surrounding them. For Sarah, the journey was still daunting, still filled with moments of doubt and fear. She knew the whispers would follow her, that there would always be those who questioned her place in his life. But with each day, she found herself growing stronger, her love for Ethan grounding her, giving her the courage to stand tall in the face of scrutiny. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of mansion, Ethan looked at her, his gaze filled with a gentle warmth, a quiet pride. "You know," he said softly, "I always thought I'd spend my life alone. That love was something I'd never know. But now, I can't imagine my life without you." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "And I never imagined I'd find someone who could make me feel like I belonged in a world so different from my own." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands intertwined, the weight of their journey behind them and the promise of a future together ahead. The world outside might never fully understand, but for them, that didn't matter. They had found something precious, something worth fighting for, something that transcended the barriers of class and status. And as they looked out at the stars beyond the windows, they knew that they were no longer bound by the expectations of others. They had forged their own path, a life built on love, respect, and an unbreakable bond that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. In each other's arms, they had found a new world, one where love was the only thing that truly mattered, a world of their own making, where they could stand together unshaken and face whatever the future would bring.